Okay, so part 2, and I'm going to continue working on the wing and getting another layer on there, which is going to make it look more realistic and solid. I got those colours already down on the wing now, so I've got a pretty good map to judge the other colours that's going to go on top by. So just mixing up some dirty greens. Adding a little bit of thinners every now and again. Not using any mediums, just odourless paint thinners, and just enough to let the paint flow off the brush. So, I got a glass palette. If I used a lot of thinners, you'd see the paints run down the palette. So that's a good judge for everybody that's watching. You can see how little I'm actually using, because I've got that palette vertically. So you can tell yourself now if you're doing your own painting, if you're painting something different and the paint's running down your palette, if you've got it like this, you may need to put, quite a little bit less thinners in there. Lots and lots of different types of, well, at least a few different types of odourless thinners out there. The two that I use frequently, number one is the Bob Ross one, virtually no smell at all, and the other is Gamsol, which also has virtually no smell, but you still need to work in a ventilated room, so make sure you've got a window or a door open or something like that if at all possible. And I only use a little tiny cup of it, and it's away from me to the side where my brushes are sitting on a rack, never ever close to my face. It's always out the way, and it's got a little neck on there as well, which helps to slow down any evaporation and vapors. So I can see there's a little bit of red should be in this section. That's something I'd missed out on my first pass, so I'm just going to pop that in. I can adjust the colours a bit more later. So it should be 2 feathers coming down there, that little bit of red, and maybe a touch in there as well. Okay, it looks weird at the moment, but when I come in and alter the blues, it's going to look a bit better. I'm just going to adjust the darker areas as well, so just add a bit of black to that mix, just to show myself the suggestions of the shadowy and dark areas. And these can all be adjusted again later on. So nothing complicated at all, just popping those in, just where the feathers separate from each other, where there's real darker shadows as well. Okay, so I've zoomed in now so you can see me working on the face a little bit more. It's a bit difficult to record because the area is very, very white, the highlights. So hopefully you're going to be able to see exactly what I'm doing here. And that's another reason for my Patreon channel, so that I can upgrade my lighting and my cameras, so I can get everything even more detailed for you. So first up on my Patreon is to get a better, faster computer, so I can process these videos much faster and perhaps even do more videos per month then. And then next up is going to be the camera and the probably the lighting as well. So very little thinners in this mix. I want it quite thick. So first of all, I'm getting a nice base white in. In those highlight areas. And I'm going to subdue it down, so I'm going to put a little bit of blue in there. A little bit of the Windsor red as well. Because a lot of these areas have got, even though it's white flesh around this section, there's a lot of colours in there as well. And a lot of red, and I think that's caused by, the vibrant red of the feathers actually bouncing around. So the colours bouncing around and influencing the white of the flesh. So I'm not afraid to put a little bit of black in there as well to subdue it. As long as I'm not using the black on its own, it's fine. So you can see even in this white section how many colours I'm managing to get in. And the reason I'm being able to do that is because, you know, the most critical part I've said before are the tones, so the lightness and darkness. And that's how people can do paintings that are using colours that are not representing or not representational of the actual colours of a subject. So they may perhaps do this bird and do it in blues and yellows and vibrant greens, you know, and make kind of like a fantasy drawing of it, but it can still look real because the lights and the darks are correct. And that's how they manage to get, you know, all these different colours in. The reason I'm doing it is because, yes, I can see hints of this in the reference photo, but it makes for a much more interesting painting for the viewer to look at. I'm just darkening this area around the beak as well, because I know I'm going over the top of these dark areas with lighter highlights, so I need a dark under layer for them to sit upon. So these are the areas that are in between the creases and the crevices, the colours that are down deep into those creases, and then the lighter whites or more vivid whites will go on top. So there's quite a lot of red by here. I know the light is really bouncing in this section. It is quite vibrant. I'm just lightly moving the paint around there. It's all still wet. Add in a little hint of orange. And stopping every now and again to really study that reference, that screen by the side of me. I don't want to rush off and find I haven't gone dark enough in areas. So I've got a clean brush now. It's not very often I really clean the brush, but when I do, I'm swishing it around in odorless thinners, creating a chiseled edge by going in thick paint and loading the brush one side then the other. And look, I'm carefully now putting this real white, creating those highlights. Hope you can see it clearly enough. I know the camera's not picking it up brilliant, but I'm just dabbing those highlights on and seeing, you know, how little detail I can get away with while still creating the look of these folds of flesh. So now you can see how that base layer was the darker layer in between the creases. and using the shape of the brush to create the angles that I need. I don't need to keep changing brushes all the time. I can get away with a lot using just one brush. So continuing the technique, you can see it perhaps a little bit better up here. And I'm not putting these in haphazardly. I'm looking at the reference. I'm seeing exactly the position of these highlighted creased areas. I especially want them to be correct around the eye. So I'm just going to continue this exact same technique now and create all these creases over the flesh area. So the important part for me to keep in mind here is that I'm not covering up all of that underpainting. I'm leaving those shadowy areas, the areas that are down in the creases. I'm leaving small parts of those there and just putting the highlight on in between them basically. Now if I had gone a bit overzealous with it and I'd put a bit too much white down, I could always let it dry, or even wet on wet, put a few of those creases back in and then come back in and do the highlights as well. So with oils generally all is not lost. We can overpaint and then that's not a problem. Just darkening up the beak as well. Notice how when you put, you know, another layer on, especially with oils, it becomes much more solid looking. And that happens whether it's a, you know, a translucent type of paint or an opaque paint. Obviously happens quicker with an opaque. So constantly refining little areas. So I'm just working on refining the beak a little bit now. Getting the colours a little bit more accurate. Getting the highlights in a bit. It's a very bright area on this top section. And now I'm just going to make a darker colour so that I can start to get the shadowy areas in the feathers. So I'm using that rose. And let's see what it's like on its own. See, it's quite a dark colour when I'm putting it over the top of another colour. So because it's quite a transparent pigment, this is actually very similar to glazing, although I'm not glazing as such. I'm not using any mediums, I'm just using the darker paint, but it is see-through. So I need a darker edge along this top as well. And then it's quite a bit darker along the back of the head. That's a bit too sharp at the top, so I just softened it by rubbing it with my finger a little bit. And yes, this section needs to be quite a bit darker, the whole section. A little bit underneath here. And then I can go in with a lighter colour. So that's the Windsor Red with a little bit of the orange in there as well. Using pretty much pure paint with no thinners at all in there, so I'm getting better coverage over the canvas. Okay, I think I'll start to put these individual red marks in, the individual feathers that are coming around this flesh section. It's a bit tricky to film it because the light's going up and down with my hands going over there, but you get the idea that I'm using the shape of the brush, positioning it correctly, and pretty much doing a one stroke on there. And it's blending a little bit with the paint underneath, but I want that. The feathers, although they're firm, they're also a little bit soft, so I don't want a real rigid edge on there, a real sharp edge. But bear in mind, I'm having to load the brush frequently because obviously it's picking up a little bit of that white. Now, I'm not worried if it's going a little bit pink because these feathers are slightly pink in there as well. But see how it's defining the shape around the face and around the eye. And there you can see there, more true to life as a little bit of shadow came in. There you can see that that's more how it looks. You know, it's not as vibrant, the white. It's much more subdued. So just to show you, I'm going to drop in a high-res photo of the finished painting so you can see how that fleshy area actually looks. So that's giving you a better idea rather than on these cameras. So you can see all the colours I've got in that white area. I'm using these single strokes now to get those individual little clumps of feathers in place. So this is not difficult to do, but you do need to keep a nice chiseled edge on the brush and also use a very fine stroke, a gentle hand when you're doing it. This is a little bit like putting butter on top of butter. With just enough thinners, if any, to make that paint come off the canvas, come off the brush on. So now I'm just going to continue to darken some areas, and you can see that develop as I speed it up a little bit. And also put some of the highlights in as well. it's still the same day, and I'm just going to continue working on the red sections of the macaw. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, one of the problems I've got to face with this is to lighten the colour. If I use white, it's going to go pink dramatically quickly. So a tiny little bit of white into the red will make it pink. So the colour I'm using to lighten it, more often than not, is the orange. You can see I'm applying it there. So it gives that vibrant look. The orange is very opaque, so that's helping me cover the canvas. And it's not making it pink at all. So I can use a tiny little bit of white if I need to. I can use a lot of the red and a lot of the orange to lighten it up. Obviously if I use too much of the orange, it's going to get that orange yellowy tinge to it rather than a vibrant red. And now that also means that I'm probably not going to be able to get the exact red that I'm seeing on the screen by doing the direct painting method. But does it really matter? Does it make any difference? As I said, I'm after an essence of this red macaw. I'm not after creating a exact photo duplicate or a duplicate of the screen. So as long as it's giving me the impression that the tones, the lights and the darks are correct, and the bird looks correct when looking at the painting, I'm not worried about matching all those exact colours. Now if I want to get it redder in the end, all I've got to do is apply a glaze with the reds and have it thinned down enough with glazing medium, and I can go over the top of this and really bring that red back out. But I'm going to go as far as I can with this direct method of painting, and it may be enough. It may very well be enough that I won't need to do any glazes at all. So you can see I'm getting a nice sharp point on that brush, still using the flat brush, the bristle brush. I use very few brushes when I'm doing most of my paintings. Once again, going in the direction of that feather growth. And just working on refinement now. So as with lots of my other painting videos, the second layer is much more refinement. Everything gets much more opaque as well. So you see less and less, and probably hardly any at all, of the canvas coming through. And you can see that what I'm really looking at is, when I'm looking at the reference, I'm seeing where the clumps of feathers are. So I'm not trying to create an individual tiny little feathery mark with little rigger brushes. I'm looking for the clumps of them. I'm sitting back as far as I can. I'm holding my brush quite far from the bristles. So pushing myself back makes me, want to work less on the detail. If you're pushing your face almost against the painting, you're really after the details. And I don't want that so much with this painting. Okay, now this dark area at the back, it's obviously got some form of highlight in there as well, and there's a little bit bluish as well in there. So I lightened that one with a little bit of light, and it's the bounce light that's lighting this area up. So a little bit lighter on this section as well. And now plenty of orange in the mix to lighten that area up, just to create the appearance now of some of these clumpy feathers. So not individual tiny feathers, but the general shape of the clumps of the feathers, the most important ones. So red and orange is what I'm using as my highlight, really. Plenty of paint, straight from the tube. And if I can get it to work with one stroke, one deliberate stroke, that's what I'm doing, rather than fiddling and going back in too many times. You can see slightly darker by there, so I used the paint that was already on the palette. It was already the right colour. That's the beauty of oil paints, because with acrylics, those paints would have dried out completely unless I was using something like a stay wet palette, and even then the top skins over quickly. Now I've darkened that red down. It's a thick paint as well. Get some of these shadowy areas in. So this is almost a bit like negative painting now. So I'm painting the shadows. It's going to be below the highlights. Otherwise the highlights are not going to show up at all. So just a general shape of the main areas, the main parts. So you can see that's quite a simple technique, but it's effective. It's doing the job, it's doing what I want. Getting those nice darks in. It's quite subtle, but it is adding some shape and form to the back of the macaw's head. Also need a little bit down here as well. The one thing I want to do, the one goal I've got, is to keep this all looking quite soft. So I can do a lot, you know, quite wet and wet. Because I don't want it to have a real, you know, rigid, sharp edge appearance. I want to keep these areas quite soft. So just speeded it up again, just to show you how I'm getting these darks in. So the darks, almost always in my paintings, are there before the actual highlights come in, so that I can overlap them. And notice how when I put those darks in, it's really making that red come alive. The red didn't look that vibrant until those darks went in. Now I can start to overlap. Okay, so I sped that little section up because I wanted to concentrate more on how I'm going to get these highlights in. Because that's more of the tricky area. That's more of the thing you're going to need to see. So it's reds and oranges. And I'm checking out my reference, seeing exactly where they're going to go before I put the brush onto the canvas. Now this is the section that I was concerned about where I may need glazes. But I'm going to carry on. I'm going to see how it turns out. It's looking okay so far. See what I mean about just a suggestion of the feathers? So a little bit of white in there, which makes it a tiny bit brighter but also more opaque. So you should see it that little bit more. Now I know it's gone a bit pink. I can glaze over it later, but I'm after the effect. You know, it's only slightly pink. It's only a little tinge of pink to it. So it's still mainly an orangey red. So you can see now as well where those darks played their part. Allow me to put these lighter shades on and for them to actually then show up. So using the brush on the side when I want a more defined edge. Being careful not to cover up all those darks. If you cover up all the darks, you're going to end up with just a flat colour. So I'm deliberately leaving little areas in between. So I'm going to carry this process on now, doing exactly the same thing down the rest of the body as well. So notice in particular I'm still using pretty much the same brush almost all the way through the painting. I'm just changing the angle on it to give me different marks, different shapes. If I'm getting overly detailed and I'm looking at the reference and it's all starting to get a bit detailed and confusing, I just squint my eyes. Squint my eyes or blur the reference photo out, and that will force me to look at the, you know, the main parts. So just a hint of a suggestion now in these darker areas and on this wing out in the distance of, you know, basic slight undulations of feathers. So certainly no detail at all in that darker section on the body. Just softening off a little bit, so exactly the same techniques as we saw earlier on. Building a few of the highlights on as well. Just an odd hint of a little bit of detail there. And with that section done, now I can start to work once again on the blue of the wings. And I'm trying some different colours as well. I've got cobalt blue, phthalo blue and Prussian blue there. It's just other colours that I've actually got in my my kit, and I think they'll be closer matching to the colours that I'm seeing on my screen. So this is kind of a second layer of blocking in. Nothing complicated to it, I'm just playing with these colours just to try and match it a little bit more. I'm subduing it with orange, so subduing it with a complementary colour. And you can see how much more opaque this is going on now. So it's covering the canvas much better. And now I'm going to speed this up a little bit at a time as well, because otherwise it's going to turn into a 4-hour video. And that's going to bore everybody and take a heck of a lot of processing as well, unfortunately. So I'm going to speed it up, but I'm not going to go too fast so you can just see how I'm blocking in. But there's nothing complicated about this section at all. So I'm just taking each individual feather one at a time. Usually getting a mid-tone in before I start to look at the shadows and then highlights. You can see I've changed the colours over that underpainting, and that's the benefit of the underpainting. I struggled to get the blue just as I wanted it initially, so I've added some of those other colour blues in. So those are the 3 on the towards the left of my palette. Just greening that mix up now. So as I was saying, that underpainting allows me, when I come back, to think, no, that's not right. But rather than it being, you know, burnt sienna underpainting or canvas cement or a white canvas, which would be even worse, now I've got a blue there. I can judge the blue I want against the blue I've got, and that makes it much, much easier. So painting in layers, especially if you're a beginner, can simplify the process a lot. You can see where you're going wrong, and if you can see where you're going wrong, then I always say then you can adjust it and make it right. The problems arise when you can't see where you're going wrong, and then what's a good idea to do is to put a bit of the blue that you're trying to match on a white piece of laminated card. You may have seen me do it in other videos if you've seen my other videos, and I can then hold that up to the reference photo. Now it works better with a photo. With the screen, you know, it doesn't work as good, but it will give you definitely a better idea of the colour you're after. Okay, so I've switched to my round brush, a fairly large one, and I'm just getting these, you know, real dark areas that are in between these major wing feathers. All still looking a bit rough and amateurish at the moment. Never give up at those stages. You've got to go through those stages to get the painting and the drawing, or whatever you're doing, even whether you're sculpting. You've got to go through the ugly, dirty looking stages before you can, you know, bring it all to life and really make it pop. You've got to do it. So don't be put off. Lots of beginners, novices, and sometimes myself can get discouraged at these stages. You'll find sometimes when you do the initial blocking, you like it, you think, wow, it's coming on really good, and then when you get to the middle stage, you think, oh, I don't know if this is working out right, I don't like it, I'm not happy with it. Experience with painting has allowed me to push through, and then things generally get better. So a little bit of refinement there now, just adjusting these colours a little bit more. I've got to work much more on it, but this is the base now that I'm going to work from. Adding a little bit of the orange here, that's warming that colour up. Okay, so now I'm going to refine these small feathered areas around the front part of the wing, and it's a tricky little area this is. So what I'm going to do, I've got my small round brush, just a little bit of dark paint on there, and I'm going to pretty much draw in the shape of the feathers, because it's like I say, it's a little tricky area. And once I've drawn in the shape of the feathers, I'm confident then that I know where each of them are going to lie, and then I can go back to my larger brush and just block in the darker areas and the highlight areas. Otherwise I think I'm going to get lost, a bit confused by it. Another way to do it would have been to let the painting dry overnight then. Then I could come back and put my reference photo over the top or trace in and go over it with a pencil. But I think I can do it with a brush good enough anyway, so I'm just going to go in, keep a close eye on my reference and try and get this these outlines mapped in there. So I'll just speed this section up because there's nothing complicated or mysterious about this, and it'll save a little bit of time so we can get back to the details. So just using that small brush, creating the edges of the feathers, so that's pretty much the shadows. So even a few marks like that, it just makes a few of the feathers pop, and that gives the viewer's eye, the opportunity to then think, yeah, there's detail there, I don't need to see detail everywhere else, I know where it is. So I'm getting the darks in first. Remember, with oils, 99% of the time, dark to light. And now I got the feather shapes in, is much easier to block in. I know where I've got to fill in, I'm not getting lost amongst the feathers. Things like feathers and spots and stripes, especially on things like zebras, as you can imagine, you can get lost in amongst them. So it pays to, block in the darks. I'm all for one for making things easier, make the process easier for myself. So blocking in the darks, blocking in the outside lines, all makes it much easier so that I can come in and do confident brush strokes, and confident brush strokes will make the painting look more professional for sure. So really thick paint now. Just don't forget, these reds are not that opaque really, so I need thick paint, and I've just added a little bit of white. Probably the only white really I've added in any substance to the red, but I wanted those feathers to actually be a little bit pink on this left hand side. So now I can start to block in these feathers with even more realistic colours before I come back in and really start to detail them up. So I'm getting in the base, and the red and green really zings together and really makes both look much more vibrant. A little tinge down there on the edges. Okay, so now I'm going to mix up a green now and start to add some more refinement to the wing feathers. So get the colours a little bit more accurate, start to get some highlights and shading in there as well. So there's not much for me to say really on the voiceover of this, so I'm really going to just let it go, and I'll speed some sections up then as well, just so that this video doesn't turn into a marathon 4 hours in length. I'm trying to show you as much detail as I possibly can, while still trying to keep the video length down a little bit to make it a bit more manageable. So you can see I'm just getting basically the the basic colouring first, then the refinement, and I'm definitely not looking to put in all those tiny little like filaments or elements in the feathers, like the barbs. I don't want to be suggesting all that, because once I start doing that, say I did it on this feather, then I've got to redo the whole painting and bring all of it up to that level. So make sure that when you decide on a level of detail, that you continue that pretty much throughout the painting. So okay, on the centre of interest, so for this it'd be the beak and the eye area, I can put a little bit more detail in there, and that helps to draw the viewer in. But if I started to then do it on the feathers of the wings and perhaps the chest area, for it to look correct, I would have to do it over the whole thing. So I wanted more of a painterly look, so I'm going to do that over the whole thing, and it can still look real just like that. So I'm just going to continue on with this, and what I'll do, I'll just speed it up a little bit so you can still see all the brushwork going in, but it'll save a little bit of time on there. Okay, so you can see now how I'm refining each of these major feathers. So I'm not worrying about little tiny feathers, but these are quite large feathers, so they do deserve to have some detail in them. Otherwise it's going to look strange to have a detailed head and beak and, you know, no detail at all in these big wing feathers. So now I can really start to get the colours correct, and I'm spending more time on the colours as well. You know, all the subtleties that's in there, that's what I want to try to bring out. So, you know, in a painting, I'd say probably 50% of the time, perhaps even more, is spent actually mixing the colours and getting the colours on your brush. I think you see with, you know, the best professional artists, they spend such a long time mixing colours, getting the tones and everything correct, and then they come and use that and just dab it on the canvas, you know, and it's perfect. So don't expect to always be brushing on the canvas. Expect to be, you know, doing a lot of colour manipulation. So now I'm putting a few of these shadow areas in. That's going to help a lot now with the lighting effect and the realism, because at the moment these wing feathers still look, you know, very much blocked in. And the subtle changes in colours what makes a difference here. All those little tiny hints. And my palette's starting to look a little bit messy in this session, and if you're doing a painting and yours is getting too messy and you haven't got anywhere to actually mix, then get rid of the mixes that you don't think you're going to use. So if you're not working on the red now, you know, get some kitchen tissue with a little bit of odorless thinners on it, just a little bit, and wipe those areas off of your palette. Here I'm putting some of those thick yellowy orange tinges in. Because I built the layers up underneath, they're now showing through much better. You can see how little bits like that affects the rest of the painting too. Bringing these highlights up is making all the reds and the blacks all look more punchy, more vibrant. And some real thick highlights there. The zing of the highlight coming from the light. Bit of yellow around the side of it. And then I'm re-establishing the light on there. So there we go, I've cleaned my palette off. It was all getting too messy. And I'm mixing up another couple of blues. Because I wasn't quite happy with the blue I had there. I wanted to get it even closer. Darkening that mix down with a little bit of blue and then black. And making it even darker still. And then a real dark for these shadows. And then that's almost pure pitch black there. And now I'm just putting in the central part of the feathers. So this is the real details on these green feathers. So I'm still using that fairly large round brush, but I'm, creating that chiseled edge as I almost do, so that I've got a nice fine point on it. And I can start to put a few highlights on. And that really brings them to life. I also need a few little lines on here as well. So see, I'm not cleaning the brush often at all, using a dirty brush, no need to keep cleaning it. Through the highlight refinements. Going back into the darks when I need to as well. On this section now I've switched over to my round brush. Brush is fairly large round brush, but I'm starting to look now and think towards the final elements and how I need to get certain areas quite dark, such as this, and the dark areas going in make the lighter areas look lighter as well. So when you come into the end of a painting, I'm not only reserving it for the lightest lights but also the darkest darks, because you usually find that by the time you're coming towards that final stages, a lot of the darks have become a bit muddy, or they weren't dark enough to start with and they need to be made a little bit darker. So in the last, on a 4-hour painting, I'd say the last hour then is really looking at the refinement of getting the darks dark enough, the lights light enough, and the colours just right. And because these are smaller elements now, I'm using a smaller brush, but still not a tiny little rigger brush, not at all. Created a chiseled edge on there then by doing that side to side stroke when I'm mixing the paints. Now I'm bearing in mind that these dark strokes that are going in, I know that I'm going to come in with nice thick paint and get the highlights on these feathers as well, and those highlights need to overlap these shadowy areas a little bit. So I need to get these dark shadows in first, really. And I'm studying the reference because I don't want to put things in the wrong place now. You can really see how getting these darks in is really starting to define these individual feathers, and I don't have to put every individual feather over the whole bird and make them all stand out. As long as I got a suggestion on the main ones, then the viewer's mind is going to fill in the rest. We know it's a bird, we know it's got feathers all over it, so we don't need to, you know, really go to town and detail every single one. I like to leave a little bit up to the imagination of the viewer as well, and I've progressed to that as I've done more and more paintings over the years. Less is more for sure. So I'm just going to continue that technique now for a short while. Now it's these small highlights and differences in between the feathers that's going to make them pop, but be careful. When you're doing subjects of your own, this is where you've got to notice the lights and the darks. You don't want to go put in something very, very light where it should just be something really, really subtle. And you see a lot of amateurs, this is where they go wrong. They come into the end, they're rushing it, perhaps they're tired, and you know, they're not taking the time to mix the paint that's of the right contrast, basically, so the right brightness, the right darkness. And sometimes in these latter stages you're looking for just tiny, tiny differences in between things like feathers and furs. So it pays now to get them right, otherwise they're going to have to be painted over again and again. So now it's time to start to get some really thick paint on now. I want to get the midtones and the highlights on these individual feathers. Some areas are going to be darker than others as well. I want nice thick paint. Let's get a few of the darks in first. So that's quite negative work, and by that I mean that I'm putting in the shadowy area, and that's making the lighter area pop a bit more. So see how that's made those lighter areas look brighter, just because you're comparing the dark against the light then, so that's getting that shadowy area in. And now I've got a real thick pure paint, The orange is there to lighten it, remember, not using white. And now I can start to get some of the details in, so I'm overlapping the shadowy areas now. And let's see how light I can get this to look without it looking too orange. So you can see quite a large brush as well. I'm using it on its side so that I've got a bit more of a smaller line so I can paint a little bit more detail. Seeing just those few marks can pop the highlight forward. Giving that suggestion of little groups of feathers. Being careful again not to wipe out completely the shadowy areas that I've just put on. And I can see now by the way this is working that I don't think I'm going to need any glazes. I'm going to actually get away with it with this direct thick paint method, so it's actually covering enough, it's overlaying enough. The orange is not too distracting, it's still looking like a red bird with sunlit areas. And the lighter I'm going on the lights now, obviously those shadowy areas and the darks are looking darker. So the brightness is starting to pop forward. And using a large brush like this obviously keeps it all looking a bit softer too. When you start to look at the rigger brush, it's going to create very sharp lines. So I don't want that. I want the softness. I want it to feel or to look like you could actually touch the bird and it'd be a soft texture. So only a couple of strokes before I have to load the brush again, because I'm putting quite a lot of thick paint on. In other videos I've obviously also said, remember, it's usually 99% of the time thick paint for the highlights and then a thinner paint for the shadowy areas. And that thick paint just leaves a little bit of texture as well, which adds even more to the effect of realism. So not much detail in the back of the head, but just a few little suggestions. I don't want it to be completely devoid of detail there. Okay, so now I've zoomed in on the head and I'm going to look to bring this up to completion now. So once again, re-establishing the darks. And that's the darkest part there that I'm putting in, so that's the part that goes, you know, where the beaks are parted slightly, so that's the darkest section. I know I've done the groundwork, so the underpainting's all done. It doesn't take long to put these details on top, and it'll be really effective when I start to put all those little cracks and scrapes on the beak, and perhaps a few more details around the eye as well. And it'll really punch this centre of interest section forward. So you can see just refinements now over the underpainting. Obviously the underpainting is dry, and I don't mind it being dry because I want some texture now in these marks that's going on. Just subtle little refinements. And that's what I mean with the underpainting is now acting as a superb map to work on against. It's so close to completion that, you know, it's quite easy for me to look at it, look at the reference and see what needs to be adjusted. So obviously always stick with your paintings, stick with the underpaintings and keep progressing and keep pushing forward. Don't give up on it. Once you start giving up on paintings halfway through, that can really have a snowball effect, and then you find all of a sudden you're doing it on virtually every painting. So I try my very best to complete every single painting I do. You can see those little marks are going in, and I'm still using that pretty large round brush. I'm creating an edge on it, a chiseled edge at the moment. Just warming that colour up a little bit with some orange. using that dirty brush. Look how infrequently I clean the brush. Very, very rarely do I do it. So now I'm putting this next layer on. You can see that the beak is starting to look more opaque. Once I get my little brush on there and start to put in those little tiniest of marks, the effect will really come to life and be finished then. So see how I'm still leaving some of that texture of the canvas on there? Using the canvas to my own benefit here, so that, you know, the little marks that the macaw's picked up while it's feeding and rubbing against branches, they've all got texture to them. This area by there needs to be a little bit more subdued, and that needs to be a bit more lighter by there. And that needs to be a little bit lighter there as well, because I need to put some quite harsh marks down on here where the beak appears to have peeled away a little bit. So I still haven't washed the brush at all. I'm still mixing and adjusting those colours. So this needs to be a little bit lighter, and I need to try and create a bit of a translucent effect here, so it's a little bit see-through. That comes down a section. A little bit lighter there as well. And the highlight by there should be a bit brighter and going up into those feathers on the top part of the beak. I now switched over to the rigger brush. So it's, even though it's a rigger, it's quite a large one. Getting a real light colour there. Thin down with some paint thinners, otherwise with the rigger brush the paint doesn't come off very easily at all. So it needs to be, you know, a little bit thin, the paint, just a bit more thinners in then. Just putting in a few suggestions of these marks where the beak's peeling and being roughed up against things. And now you can really see how that underpainting is doing all the work, and these just little marks, final details, bringing it to life. This section needs to be a bit lighter as well, which catching the light right on the edge. Thick paint. A few sections on this bottom beak as well. That's a bit too light, so I can tap down my finger to subdue it. But I want this edge here to be light. A very light touch for the thinnest of marks as well. And this section by here, right where it's kind of peeled off the tip. This is the lightest section of the highlight by there, in the top of that beak and down the front of it as well. So I have cleaned the brush off now because I'm switching, you know, from something very light to something very dark. So I just want to work around the eye a little bit, just to tidy up these marks. See, we're putting in that shadow, how it's, you know, made the lights look lighter. This is not a pure black at all, it's more of a reddy brown. Resting my hand on the marl stick to keep it nice and steady as well. Now, different brush, it's been cleaned. Just want to tidy up this area a little bit. So let's add in that little bit more detail because this is the centre of interest. I'm not going to go crazy with it, but I just put in a few of these creases. It'll make it look, it'll make everything appear more detailed then. Okay, going back over to the round brush now. I only use that rigger for very, very fine lines. And I want to change the shape of the pupil a bit. It looks like it's a bit lopsided down the bottom, so I'm going back in with the eye colour. A little bit lighter now because this is the last touches on there. And the macaw's eye should be, the pupil should be really quite round, so I'm just adjusting it so it is looking directly at us rather than slightly down. There, that looks better already. A little bit of the highlight to pop it again. Okay, so I'm just going to add a few more details. I want to do a little bit more highlight around the eye. Really thick paint now, pure white. Just a few little touches. A little bit underneath as well. And I'm coming in with the rigger brush again. So I just want to put the suggestion of the highlights on the feathers just on this section to the right, because it's a little bit devoid of any details at the moment. So I don't want them to be too obvious at all, but I should just be able to get those little orangey marks of the feathers in. Okay, that's a bit better. You can just about see them. I'm being cautious. I don't want to go too light because I don't want these to be too obvious. So I'm just creeping up on it. And that one's a little bit too obvious, so I've just smudged him out. And that's the benefit of having a nice dry underpainting. Now, you wouldn't want to actually put solvent or, odorless paint thinners on a tissue and rub the painting, because it is going to lift the underlayers. They're not that dry, but rubbing it with your finger or a bit of a dry tissue would be okay. Now I just want to tidy up a couple of these little individual feathers as well, just here and there, just a little bit of tidy up. And there's also a couple of little feathers I haven't put in that go really close to the eye. A couple on this position as well. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video and you've learned something from it. I know I certainly have. A red subject is not that easy to paint, especially if you're not doing glazes. But, painting's great. Should be a learning process. I don't like it when paintings are too easy. They can become very boring then as well. And if you've got suggestions for other things you'd like me to cover on my Patreon channel, just let me know and I'll see what we can do. If we get enough people want the same thing, I'll surely try to make a new video. See you all again real soon.